Chapter 5. The Melting Pot. It was the early 70s and there were plenty of people engaging in bizarre activities, such as cavorting in public places in papier-mâché masks and calling it street theatre. One of these groups needed a musical actor. This was my escape from teaching. It was fun. For a while. However, after 3 months on £25 a week, my enthusiasm began to weaken. One day, after getting blank stares from an old people's home in Southwark, we had to perform in a youth club in Camden. For the first 15 minutes of the show, I had to remain in a mobile wardrobe, waiting for my cue. At the end of 10 minutes, it was clear that the audience, which was seated on the floor a few feet from the wardrobe, was beginning to lose the plot. After 12 minutes, they lost it completely, rushed the stage and pushed over the wardrobe. It crashed to the floor and collapsed. I rose from the wreckage like some deep-sea monster, ready to have my revenge on these little fishes. They turned out to be piranhas. We all fled in confusion. I felt that if I were going to be humiliated by children, I'd rather be paid a proper wage for it. After ringing every borough in London, I discovered that the only one desperate enough to employ my talents was Division 4, alias the London Borough of Hackney. When I arrived to teach at Clissold Park School, there were children of every origin under the sun, and yet not one group could claim a majority. Over 80 languages were spoken at the homes of the children. It was a true melting pot. Here in Hackney, it seemed that all the chickens of the former British Empire had come home to roost. So had I. For a while. By this time, I had developed various tricks that might help me out in the kind of emergency situations that a supply teacher comes across on a daily basis. One of these was to tell the stories of the Shakespeare plays, Hamlet, Macbeth, and Romeo and Juliet. With the promise of a tale full of sex, violence, and death, I used to be able to hold the attention of a class for a full 45 minutes, the usual length of a lesson. At Clissold Park School, the teacher of the special needs, then known as remedial group, was taking an extended sick leave, so I was asked to teach them. For our first lesson, we were herded into a bare room without seats, tables, or any kind of teaching equipment. There were 4 walls, a floor, 15 adolescents, and me. Clearly, it was story time. I sat them on the floor and launched into Romeo and Juliet with gusto, highlighting the sexual and violent aspects with as much vim as I could muster without, of course, incriminating myself. It worked like a dream for precisely 45 minutes. Unfortunately, I had not realized that in this school, the lesson periods lasted 1 hour and 10 minutes. I had nothing to offer for the last 25. As the story came to an end, my audience realized that I had blown it. For a brief moment, they looked at me with a mixture of triumph and disgust. Then, quite suddenly, as if I was no longer there, they threw themselves with real enthusiasm into a scrum on the floor. Should I pull them apart? Should I run for help? If I left them, they might do some damage to each other. Sending a child out for help is always fatal. They never come back. Maybe I should just watch and prevent anything too serious taking place. The end of the lesson was bound to come soon. There was one young man not involved in the fray. In his black three-piece suit and polished black shoes, he came over to me and said in a Bengali accent, "There's nothing you can do, Mr. Baldwin. They are animals. They don't understand what education is. Leave them." I took Ali's advice and talked to him for the remaining minutes, only intervening when physical injury was imminent. Ali had been put into the special needs group because his English was poor. He had only been in England for 2 years, yet he already spoke and wrote with clarity and precision. He seemed so genteel, so old-fashioned compared to the other students, that I wondered how he would survive in the rough and tumble of life in Hackney. Some 15 years later, I met him again. He was married with 4 children. He owned his own house and 2 restaurants. His manners and use of English still seemed from another time. That is to say, they were impeccable. Ali was like a reminder of a world we had lost, or perhaps in most of Britain had never really had. Most of the pupils at Clissold Park weren't like Ali. Sid Vicious of the Sex Pistols was the only former pupil of any note. The parish of Stoke Newington had the reputation at that time for being the murder capital of Europe. Burnt-out cars adorned the streets. Houses were falling apart from neglect. The police rivaled the local villains for brutality and drug trading. If the area was difficult, the school was no easier. It was a modern red brick, purpose-built comprehensive, and had been designed, like most schools, by a person who had never taught in a school in his life. Of course, architects do attend schools as children. It must be there that they learn to hate their teachers. For architects who design schools are really carrying out an act of revenge. Modern school design is, in fact, a monument to the public humiliation of the teaching profession by spiteful architects. Not a moment's thought has ever been given to the security and comfort of teachers. Staff rooms are uniformly hideous, and classrooms are bear pits with screeching floors and huge windows put in for the entertainment of the students. I'm quite sure that even now there are hundreds of self-satisfied architects in their fully carpeted, subtly lit, architect-designed offices, congratulating themselves on the part they played in the destruction of teacher morale. The design of Clissold Park School, built in the 1960s, was particularly grim. The building spread on 2 floors in every direction. There were long, dark corridors connecting the classrooms, some of which were totally isolated and at least 15 minutes' walk from the staff room. Once you were in a classroom with 30 brooding, pubescent adolescents, you could expect no support, no assistance from the outside world. It was you or them. If you were not careful, they could even block your escape. It was wise to sit by the door, for when things went wrong, they went badly wrong. You could have been murdered 3 times over before any adult would have noticed, and that would have been the cleaner sweeping up the rubbish at the end of the day. However, perhaps knowing that the building at least was on their side and that the teachers, and not they, were the likely victims, the children were fairly relaxed. Indeed, there was an atmosphere of rub-along understanding between most of the pupils. There were few racial conflicts and no gangs or cliques. In the staff room, there were enough real enthusiasts and idealists to give the place a feeling that they wanted the children to do well, even though no one was quite sure how this could be achieved. Plays were put on, discos and concerts were held. Teachers gave up evenings and weekends in the effort to make a difference to the lives of the children in their school. I began to feel that maybe I could make a small difference too. I needed to establish myself on a more permanent footing. I was offered a temporary post at Edith Cavell's school in the southern part of the borough, teaching social studies. I took it. I had stepped back into another time. Edith Cavell was a small school in 2 Victorian buildings that had not been improved or modified since they were built. It was designated a comprehensive, but was in reality a secondary modern. Till the advent of the Certificate of Secondary Education, it was unlikely that students at this school sat any examinations. When the certificate, which was designed for pupils considered unfit to take O-levels, came into being, the headmaster immediately decreed that Edith Cavell was a CSE school. That meant that no class was to be prepared for any higher examination. A group of parents resented this limitation on their children's progress, and by threatening to remove their children completely, forced the head to institute a special class that would be allowed to sit the O-level examination. Otherwise, things carried on much as before. As the head was an invalid, he only attended the school 1.5 days a week. He presided over 1 staff meeting a term, during which he handed out written proclamations. Any dissent from his staff was dealt with by an abrupt closure of the meeting. In his absence, the running of the school was left to his deputies. 2 of these were women who, had they not somehow become involved in education, might have been found running seaside guest houses, harassing their customers with codes of conduct incomprehensible to anyone but themselves. Thus it was 2 days before the O-level exams that GCSE students were lined up by the upper school deputy, who appeared before them in white pancake makeup and smudged crimson lipstick. She then proceeded to conduct a sock inspection, which resulted in the sending home of those who had failed to comply with regulations. In spite of this quirky authoritarianism, there were some teachers with enough common sense and interest in the pupils to redeem the place. A music teacher put on choral concerts involving 200 children. Choral because there were not enough instruments in the school to form a band. A history teacher worked hours of overtime, giving his pupils the best possible chance of getting through their exams. The other asset of the school was the fact that neither site contained more than 400 pupils. The teachers got to know their pupils well, and there was none of that alienation felt by everyone at schools with 1,500 or more on the one side. Control was further assisted by the nature of the buildings. Being Victorian, both had high ceilings and windows. Children could only see the sky, and so were prevented from observing the distractions of everyday life in the streets outside. The classrooms were set on 3 floors, each with a single corridor joined by a common staircase. Thus, the senior master, with quick glances along the corridors, could see for himself any miscreants or stragglers. These would be speedily rounded up and dealt with. This made life considerably easier for the teachers. You only had to ask a pupil to leave the room, and they knew that trouble awaited them. However, there's always someone who can turn a good system on its head. Edika had not been in London very long. having arrived from St. Lucia only recently. For her first 6 weeks at school, she hardly said a word to anyone. Sometimes I did hear her say something to a friend, but it was in St. Lucian patois, and I couldn't make it out. In any case, whenever I spoke to her in class, she would look away. One day she felt that the time had come to make her stand. She rose. "I going," she announced. "No, Edika, you are not. Please sit down." She strode firmly towards the door. I stood in front of the door. She bit me on the arm. Luckily, I was wearing a sturdy tweed jacket and only suffered a bruise. Ever since then, and even in the warmest weather, I have always worn my sturdy tweed coat in class. Edika smiled. "Okay," she said, and returned to her seat. After that, she spoke, made friends, and played an active role in the life of the school. Edika had made her mark. It remained on my arm for some time. 5 years later, I met her in Ridley Road Market. She apologised profusely in perfect English. Speaking of English, one morning I heard, to my surprise, what I thought was a strong West Country accent coming from the next room. When I located the speaker, it turned out that she was dark-skinned and from Barbados. Maureen, for it was she, became a good friend and quickly introduced me to her 3 mates. The 4 girls were inseparable and livened up the gloomy Victorian surroundings with their effervescent wit and sense of fun. Shortly before they were due to leave school, one of them, Jasvindra, stopped attending. I asked Maureen what had happened. She explained that Jazz was going to be married and had been forbidden from mixing with her friends from school. Maureen had made an effort to go round to her house and had been told briefly by Jazz that she was being kept in until the wedding day. Nevertheless, invitations were issued, and I, along with Maureen and her friends, was lucky enough to receive one. Jasvindra was married to a young man from Pakistan whom she had not previously met. After the ceremony, they went to live in Birmingham. Her friends never saw her again. Aziz, like Jasvindra, was a Londoner with parents from Pakistan. He was an intelligent and charming person. Most people liked him, including a group of white boys with whom he sat in class. Yet these boys were profoundly racist and boasted of beating up Pakis out of school. "They stink. They breed like rabbits and they get all the council flats. We hate them. This is our country, innit? Yeah, so that's why we beat them up," they would explain. "But surely," I would ask, "you wouldn't beat up Aziz?" "Oh no, Aziz is all right. He's a mate, innit, Aziz?" Aziz would nod. "But isn't Aziz a Pakistani?" "Well, we don't know about that. But he's not a Paki. He's different. He's all right." I didn't get very far. In fact, I found that this group of boys was very hard to teach at all. They were resentful, bitter, and so convinced that the world was against them that they saw education as part of a liberal conspiracy to perpetuate their place at the bottom of the social order. They had no faith in the system. It had done nothing for their parents or their grandparents. They knew only that their streets were being invaded by people they didn't understand. Just because they liked and understood Aziz, it didn't mean that they saw the Pakis as anything other than the enemy. Nevertheless, I reflected that if Aziz had been at a separate Muslim school, those boys would not have had a chance to get to know him at all. Whether or not Aziz would have agreed with me, I do not know. Sports Day is a day when all the festering sores of the life of the school are given an airing in the summer sun. So it was at Edith Cavell. The pupils were bussed down to the East London Stadium and the competitions began. Boys and girls threw things about, jumped high and long, ran round in circles and generally had a good time. Then came the final race and the highlight of the day. The staff had graciously accepted the challenge of taking on the boys at the 4 times 100 metres relay race. The men were in their 20s and were all PE teachers. It was clear from their apparel and demeanour that they were going to take this seriously. The boys of West African or Caribbean origin were all 16 years old. A hush fell as the runners lined up for the start. "On your marks, get set, bang!" And they were off. By the end of the first leg, the boys were 20 yards ahead. By the end of the third, they were 50 yards ahead, and by the time that they ran in as winners, the staff team was just exchanging batons at the final changeover. The men returned to the changing rooms with glum faces. As they removed their sweaty socks and shoes, they began to argue amongst themselves. Who hadn't given their all? Who had let the side down? Who had let them be humiliated by a bunch of school kids? One of the men, the only one of Caribbean origin, rose and said, "You should be happy for those boys. They're going to be great athletes. That's what we're here for, isn't it?" The heads of the remaining 3 sank into their chests. Sports Day was over. The end of term was looming. However, there was one further battle to be fought. The government was trying, yet again, to reduce expenditure on education. Edith Cavell had to make cuts in its programme. The small social studies department which I ran was faced with closure. Letters were written to the ministry in protest. Meetings were held with officials of the Department of Education. I went on a demonstration holding a placard which read, "Bloodletting, no cure." We assembled at a disused cinema, now a supermarket, at Stamford Hill to hear Ken Livingstone speak against the cuts. On the way back, a history teacher from a neighbouring school asked me if I would like to apply to join her department. As I had a feeling that my temporary job as head of the social studies department at Edith Cavell was about to be terminated, I graciously accepted the offer.